Hello, everybody. Today we're going to discuss our second set of notes for our introduction unit on taxonomy and the classification of animals. Um, and I think this is a pretty important topic. It's also why it's in our introduction unit because it's one of the more important topics. Because if you just look at the diversity of life, there is so much variation out there. Um, and being able to kind of classify and order things and put them into correct groupings and see how they're related is a really important topic. And so we know that there are a little bit more than 1.5 million species of animals that are named, but that only accounts for about 20% of all animals living and less than 1% of extinct animals that have ever lived. So that's a really, really small percentage. Um, Taxonomy itself, um, that's the formal system for naming, classifying, and classifying species based off of like anatomical similarities, biogeography, so where they live in the world and where they're found, molecular components, think of cells and DNA, and what you find inside of those cells, and development, how they develop from an embryo to a full-sized organism. There are kind of two fathers of taxonomy. The first one was Aristotle, who just basically started to try to organize and name things, but the real like main man, the real founder of this field was Carl Linnaeus, and you probably learned a little bit about him in biology. We still use his system today of like naming and ranking organisms based on like binomial nomenclature that Carl Linnaeus came up with. And so, if we're talking about like taxonomic ranks, there are 7 major groups that you need to know. And this is the order from biggest to smallest. So it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I remember it by using the acronym King Philip came over for a great soup. So King Philip came over for great soup, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Um, we also have this other group. It's more of a new level. It's happened within the last 30 years, and they're called domains. Domains are the highest taxonomic rank above kingdoms. They're based on rRNA sequences. Remember a little bit about biology. rRNA is part of the ribosomal subunit, so the ribosome helps to make proteins. And why they use rRNA is because it's remained relatively unchanged um, over millions of years of evolution because every organism needs that ribosome to make proteins. And so that rRNA sequence isn't subject to things like gene transfer and mutations. So if organisms share more of their rRNA, that means they're more closely related, and it's not because of things like mutations. So there are 3 different domains. They are archaea, bacteria, and eukarya, and all animals are placed in the domain eukarya and the kingdom animalia. All right, so we can see how you can take an animal and look at their full like taxonomic ranking here. So let's just take the human, for example. The human would be kingdom Animalia. The phylum would be Chordata. There's also a subphylum. I'll talk about those on a different day. Um, then there'd be class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, and species Homo sapien. Right, that's a big mouthful, but it is the full like taxonomic rank of how you would organize or name something. So when we name animals, you don't necessarily want to list the whole kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? That's just a mouthful. And so we have this process called nomenclature. And nomenclature is basically just a 2-word naming system, um, also known as binomial nomenclature, um, where the first word is the genus. If we are handwriting that or typing it, the genus is capitalized, and the second word is the species, and that's usually lowercase. If I am writing it out, I would like you to underline it. And you can see my example here. So Homo is the genus, and that is capitalized. Sapien is the species, and it is not, and the whole thing is underlined. Um, so that would be a way that we can say human. Um, its binomial nomenclature would be Homo sapien. I don't need to give you the whole Animalia, Chordata, so on, so on, so on. I can just give you Homo sapien. Now, there are some species where we have to include a subspecies, like you see here. This is a species of salamander, Encentina eschscholtzi. Um, but there are lots of little subspecies based on the location they're found, right? So these are salamanders found in California. They're all very closely related, but they have subspecies based on where they're found. Um, and in this case, where they're closely related and there's a subspecies, we would use the third name, and that's called trinomial nomenclature, where you use um, the genus, species, and subspecies. So moving on to like how can we show the relationships of animals in like this graphical form? Um, that's when we get to two features. One is called a cladogram, and the other one is called a phylogenetic tree. A cladogram is based off of almost purely physical characteristics, while a phylogenetic tree uses different mathematical analyses to kind of form this hypothetical relationship. And I'll talk about phylogenetic trees just in a minute here. So here's an example of a cladogram where I see where I'm comparing these different animals, so an amphioxus, a bass, a lizard, a horse, and a monkey, and I'm differentiating them by the different characteristics, right? So what separates a bass, a lizard, a horse, and a monkey from an amphioxus is that all of them besides the amphioxus have vertebra and jaws. What separates a bass from the lizard, horse, and monkey? The bass doesn't have four legs and an amniotic egg, so on and so on, right? So the lizard doesn't have hair or mammary glands. Um, my amphioxus is what's called an outgroup. The outgroup is something that doesn't share any of the defining characteristics with the other taxa or groups of animals, right? So basically shares none of these characteristics. Let's just look at this, right? If I asked you what separates a lamprey from a tuna, you should be able to look at this cladogram and see, well, a lamprey doesn't have this characteristics, which is a jaw. What separates a salamander from a turtle? Amniotic egg. In general, that's how you would look at these cladograms. Phylogenetic tree, you can see is a little bit more complicated. There are these numbers. These numbers are based off of things like cytology, so the study of the cells, morphology, those are things like symmetry, how many different embryonic layers it has, and so on. And then biochemistry. And if you put all of that data together, it basically gives you a number. And the numbers show how closely related things are. Um, now, phylogenetic trees are only as accurate as the data that is available. Right? Some species might have more data available than other species. And so phylogenetic trees are basically always being altered when there's new data given. Um, so I brought this up, but I just want to hit this again because these are the areas that we're going to study for the rest of our introduction unit. It's basically all of these morphology characteristics used to classify animals, right? So we're going to have a unit on symmetry. So are they radially symmetric or are they bilaterally symmetric? Um, what embryonic layers do they have? Do they have two germ layers or three germ layers? How does the zygote form the embryo? Right. So, what different cleavages or cell divisions does it do? Um, in what order. Um, and all of that might sound confusing now, but again, we're going to get into that in our next kind of chapters in this for zoology. Here's just an example. Um, so you can be a protostome, like we see here, where it has a specific type of cell cleavage to form an opening. Um, where in a protostome, the mouth forms near the blastopore. So basically, the mouth forms first, and it's the first new opening, and then the anus forms second. Well, in a deuterostome, it goes through a different series of cell cleavage to lead to the anus forming first and the mouth forming second. Hopefully, you understood at least some of this. We're going to work through examples of this in class. But thank you for listening. Have a good day.